So far we've talked about facing your shadow, leading out of your marriage or singleness, and slowing down for loving union with Jesus. This now is the fourth or final pillar of an inner life of an emotionally healthy leader. It's called having a rhythm of work and Sabbath. So this study is going to introduce you and your team to this large topic of biblical Sabbath. That is a 24-hour block of time in which we stop our work, rest, practice delight, and contemplate God. And we do this not out of a form of legalism, but as a core spiritual formation discipline, much like prayer and Bible study in our life with Christ. When Jerry and I began our journey into emotionally healthy spirituality in 1996, one of the things I gained was a new perspective on the importance of having a Sabbath rhythm. So I read a few books, occasionally mentioned Sabbath in sermons, and I experimented with taking a day of rest each week. But I wasn't quite sure how Sabbath really was different than a day off. What was and what was not permissible. How could I set aside a full day of rest when I had 4 small children to care for? And what about the pastoral crises that inevitably showed up? So what happened over time, the demands of life and leadership and pastoral work, it crushed my Sabbath experiment. I returned to taking a regular day off on Mondays, and from time to time over the next 7 years, I made several unsuccessful attempts to restart a consistent Sabbath practice. It was only after the life-changing experience of our second sabbatical in 2003, 2004, that I felt compelled to figure out this Sabbath thing once and for all, not only for myself, but for the sake of our church. So I set aside time to study Sabbath, doing a biblical word study on every occurrence of Sabbath from Genesis to Revelation. I read most available Christian books on Sabbath, and I looked closely at the rich 3,500-year Jewish origin tradition of Sabbath. So out of that intensive study, I identified the 4 foundational characteristics that define Sabbath as a 24-hour block of time in which we stop work, enjoy rest, practice delight, and contemplate God. These 4 characteristics have served me well in distinguishing a routine day off from a biblical Sabbath. And over the years, my understanding of Sabbath practice has deepened and broadened, especially for those of us under pressure in positions of leadership. And so in this chapter, you're going to consider, for example, how Sabbath is a resistance to powers and principalities. In other words, there's a serious element of spiritual warfare that we're engaged in around Sabbath. And it's not just for us. We Sabbath as a witness to the people we serve and to the world around us. Sabbath is also a rich place where God speaks to us and reveals things to us in very unique ways. Practicing Sabbath can be rich and beautiful, but we have to be willing to create a protective container, that is, the boundaries that make it possible. So in order to enter into it, we have to establish guidelines that distinguish Sabbath from business as usual the other days of the week. So the key is to take these 4 principles of Sabbath: stop, rest, delight, and contemplate, and build your protective container accordingly. Now, this theology around Sabbath is very important because you'll need time and lots of trial and error to work it out in your context. And these principles have served people around the world. The Israelites did not learn Sabbath in a day. Scripture indicates it took them years. So read this chapter slowly and prayerfully, and be sure to take the How Healthy is Your Practice of Sabbath Delight assessment that's found on pages 149 to 150 of the book. You'll want to think of examples of people, places, and activities that fill you with joy and delight. That's going to become key. And begin to think through some things that you would include on your will and will not do list for Sabbath. And then you'll want to think of one step you can take towards implementing a weekly 24-hour Sabbath. Maybe you'll want to turn your day off into a Sabbath, or maybe just even start with 12 hours and then move from there. So we've got some wonderful free resources and sermons and FAQs, answers on our website at emotionallyhealthy.org, and I encourage you to go find them and look at those. Thank you. Blessings to you.